Welcome everybody back to our little show here. We have to bring something to you that we already promised a few days ago, a few weeks ago, when those of you who follow us closely will have stumbled about something that we don't normally do. We don't do book premieres. You know, we're not Barnes and Noble or Waterstones or something like that. We're a music blog. But if we stumble about something or across something that is as interesting as Michael's book here, then we are happy to join in all the hype for it. So, Michael Tao, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Michael, maybe we should first of all explain a little bit about what your book is about, because I know that not everybody will have read the excerpt that we put on our website. Not everybody might have had the time to it. So maybe you explain your idea behind your book, which is about extreme music.
Yes. So the book is called Extreme Music. And, when people think of that, they might think it's just going to be a description of, all sorts of different extreme music genres, like subgenres of metal, subgenres of hardcore punk, etc. But it's a little bit different. So I see the book as exploring certain extreme concepts within the music world.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be, very, very, very esoteric, very, very arcane. But I find myself very interested to, in what happens when you take an extreme idea and explore it to the very, very fringe. So, for example, there's a chapter on music that's very, very loud and very, very, very maximalist to the point that it's just sheets of harsh noise wall.
Yeah.
Or there's chapters on compositions, music compositions that are very, 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 very long or very, very, very short, or music that's extremely vulgar. So just these different extreme concepts, and as they manifest in the music world, and often at the very deep underground of music culture.
That is also something that I can highly suggest as a reason for everybody to read Michael's book. Being a music nerd myself, and someone who thinks he has a pretty good knowledge of music, it's always fun to come across publications and records and labels, however you want to call it, which show you that you don't know shit. And when I read Michael's book, I was like, okay, I don't know anything, which is always a cool effect. So there were a lot of artists that I first had to listen on, or that I had to do some digging before I wanted to read on. And I think that's also a very good idea. When you read Michael's book, take your time. Don't read it in one sitting. Don't read it like a regular book. Take your time, listen to the stuff that he's referring to, because you will discover a heck of a lot of music. And to also show it maybe from like our always very genre-oriented version, you will find cross-references to Merzbow, which might be one of the most prominent and most famous noise producers ever. We'll also have to talk about him in a moment. But you will also see that there are tons of artists behind that one figure that many of us know. And, it's also interesting to see how you come up with the cross-references. If anybody has looked at our website, you will have seen that we have published one of the chapters on noise. And if we think about it, noise itself is a very difficult term. Michael, for example, let's take that as like one momentum. How do you define noise for yourself?
Great question. And I imagine there may be many different technical definitions. I think in the book, I make reference to, the idea of the signal to noise ratio, as we think of, more organized sound versus extraneous or random sound. And so I think how that idea carries through into the music genre of noise is you're talking about music that's doesn't have the typical hallmarks of music that average people might listen to. So it might be highly abrasive, highly random, sheets of noise that are often quite harsh. And in the book, I explore it all to the logical, all the way forward to the logical extreme of harsh noise wall, which is music that are just completely unchanging blocks of harsh noise, almost as though you have someone turn on a white noise generator, turn on a microphone, step out of the room, let it record for an hour, then come back and turn it off. And that's a harsh noise wall. Um, so I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but we're talking about a lack of what would conventionally be thought of as organized sound.
Yeah. And I think that's also very interesting. Basically, whenever we talk about stuff like noise or punk, whenever we maybe even use genres, we have to remember that they can always be reinterpreted in completely different ways. When Michael looks at music and when he thinks about noise, one of the things that you do is you think about very complex ideas. I have a friend, whenever you would wake him up at 3 o'clock in the morning and we would say, like, what is noise? He would say, Jesus, lizard, and insane, and now let me sleep.
Right. Great bands.
Which is also fine, right? So I think it's very interesting to also challenge your own notions of genres. Michael, is that something that you ever think about when you listen to music, genres?
Yes, absolutely. And I know genres are complicated because on one hand, they help us organize our thoughts about music, but on the other hand, they can constrain us or kind of, impose categories that limit creative freedom. And so I will say Unsane is mentioned in my book because I consider Unsane amongst the loudest and noisiest of the bands out there and love them. I also love the Jesus Lizard. And that kind of noisy noise rock / post-hardcore to me is some of the most, vitally enthralling, heavy, loud music out there. And it's it often shares elements of noise that are seen in the music of pure noise artists like Merzbow, right? So I think generally genres are important in terms of helping us organize our thoughts and think about music systematically, and it can also help describe communities of people who are influenced by one another. But of course, we can't be constrained by genre categories entirely.
Yeah. And it's also the way, Merzbow himself said it wonderfully, and we all know the famous quote, if noise is music that makes you feel uncomfortable, then pop to me is noise music. And I think there is a lot of truth in there. And it's also interesting that a lot of people like me who grew up in the 90s, we would, of course, always call up the Holy Trinity, like Jesus Lizard, Unsane, and probably Helmet. But when you look at those three bands, and when you look at the songs they wrote, you will see that a lot of them still play, I don't want to say conventional music, but a very, very well-organized music, to use your term. It very often has a clear structure, whereas others like Merzbow, KK Null, and others, they don't give an F about any kind of structure. And still, many people would categorize both as noise. So noise, very difficult term, but I think that applies to a lot of them. If we talk about grindcore, there is a huge difference between Agoraphobic Nosebleed and, let's say, Vulnificus. Huge difference. Still, both are called grindcore. Nerd question. Because I have a friend of mine who categorizes his collection according to genres, and we always fight about it. How do you categorize your collection?
My collection is in too disorganized a state to be categorized by genre. And it's just all, there is a recent move, and so everything is in boxes at the moment. But it's a great question. I think I do try to organize music, like whether it's in playlists or computer files or on the shelf according to genre, but it's a fool's errand, right? You're just like, every other thing, you're like, does it belong here or somewhere else? sometimes I like thinking about things in terms of like era or even the record label they appeared on. 'Cause those are other ways to think about it. And Thorsten, I apologize. I just wanted to check in terms of the internet connection. Are you finding that it's laggy on my end?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because sometimes,
If
sorry to
if you want to
interrupt the
make
flow
sure
of
that
the
it's
interview.
not lagging, then you can do the happy dance in between.
Okay, we'll do the happy
So,
dance next time.
so let's come to a few of the questions that have been sent in by people who saw um our wish to get questions for you. And we have a few of them. Your PR man Dan and I narrowed them down, and so we have 10 of them.
Oh wow, great.
How do you let's come up with the first one. I like that a lot. And it's already something that would make me sweat. How do you specify the quality of extremeness of extreme music in a broad sense? For example, and that is good. I think the person who sent that in, he even gave us an example. For example, we can speak of Public Image Limited, of the Flowers of Romance era, as the band with quite obvious extreme qualities versus artists like Merzbow or Bastard Noise. So how do you specify extremeness in a broad
I think
sense?
I think it's a great question because extreme can mean different things to many different people. In my book, when I refer to extreme, I refer to it in sense of concepts, or maybe even another way of putting this would be the purity of a concept carried to its logical extreme. So that's different from just categorizing extreme as music that sounds very extreme or sounds very harsh or rapid or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in exploring a sound concept taken to its most conceptually pure fringe. So another example of this would be electronic music, right?
Mm-hmm.
People might consider all sorts of things extreme in
Mm-hmm.
electronic music. Dubstep could be considered extreme, you know, biggest bass drop of all time, however you want to put it. The way I looked at electronic music was looking at tempo. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
exploring the outer fringe of music that has a very, very rapid beats per minute. So we think of 200 beats per minute. If you listen to music like that, it's like it sounds incredibly extreme. But there are people who are experimenting with beats per minute of 500, 750, 1,000, and beyond. So that's what I was curious. Like, what happens if we take this idea to its most logical extreme? So I think that's the way I approach extreme in my book. But many different people might have many different ways of categorizing it, and I think that's okay.
When you are talking about beats per minute, I have to jump in with a question. Do you think that there is a certain number of beats per minute that if you cross that, it becomes inaudible?
It does. I mean, it doesn't. The individual beats become inaudible, but once you reach a certain beats per minute, it just starts to sound like a tone because
Yeah,
each beat is serving as a cycle,
yeah,
and so you're hearing the
exactly.
tone. So at the extreme, there's a subset of artists known as extra tone artists
Yeah.
who are specifically exploring that transition between beat and tone. But you're absolutely right, Thorsten. It ceases to become individually audible beats.
Yeah. Next question that we got from our readers. There are lots of cases when artists consciously drive the composition to a certain point, edgy or extreme. Mogwai with their debut album would be a good example, or My Bloody Valentine. How would you
Mm-hmm.
comment on those?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think on one hand, those types of extremes are a little bit different from the ones that are covered in my book.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, it's kind of just another way of thinking of the same thing, right? Taking a concept to its absolute extreme. So my understanding of My Bloody Valentine was that they did a number of things that could be thought of as extreme. Um, Kevin Shields was really focused on the particulars on a very granular level of how the
Definitely.
guitar sounded, was a perfectionist about that. Plus, just the sheer quantity of overdubs to create these walls of sound could be seen as extreme. So I think there are lots of ways that you could think about that music. I know Mogwai was famous for the, this is a bit before when I was going to shows, but for having the loudest live performances of any band. You'd walk out of there just sort of overwhelmed by the massive sound. So there are ways in which these artists are extreme on conceptual levels, and I think that's really interesting to explore.
I always like to share, and I think I already did this twice or thrice here on our little interview series. My first encounter with Mogwai was when they did an interview in German television, and they were asked, "What is your aim in making music?" And Stewart, with his wonderful Glaswegian accent, only said, "Oh, we want to be louder than Manowar." And I'm very sure they did that.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
Is that something that you also think of extreme? I mean, like, we don't often have that, or we don't have it as much anymore in metal, but we still do have it, for example, in hip hop. This volume war, like how loud can you make a record? Is that also some form of extremeness to you?
So I start off, there is a chapter about extremes of loudness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it starts off with a discussion of the loudness war, which is more of a technological war using dynamic range compression to make music sound louder and louder. And so I know that the band Sleigh Bells, this is covered in the book, they were ones who explored using dynamic range compression as its own kind of artistic technique to see what happens if we explore this variable to its extreme. And so, yes, I think that, and at the same time, the majority of the book is about recorded music, and live performance is a completely separate thing, right?
Of course.
I think it's harder to carry forward loudness into a recording where, I can just turn the volume knob up and down, right?
Yeah.
That as opposed to actually a live performance. So yeah, I mean, in my opinion, the bands that you identified earlier, Unsane, Helmet, like when I listen to these bands, these are bands that I love. And it's because to me, they have this feeling of loudness, which maybe a better term for that is heaviness. But in the book, I look at loudness as kind of just being like what happens if all of the sound is raised to the absolute maximum. And I do think harsh noise or harsh noise wall is the total apogee of that. But yes, there's many different ways to think about loud.
What was the loudest concert that you ever been to?
I think it was Acid Mother's Temple. This was years ago, but I went to an Acid Mother's Temple show, and that struck me as being the loudest show that I ever went to. Although many years ago, I also went to I used to go to noise shows back when I was living in Montreal, and there were some Wolf-Eye shows that were pretty loud, as well as some more local noise bands of the era, and those were loud. But again, interestingly, right, Acid Mother's Temple, it's more organized sound. So in some ways, it just sounds louder when it's like organized sound carried to its absolute max. What's the loudest show you ever went to, Thorsten? Not to put you on the spot.
No. I have been thinking about that question because I was very sure that you would ask the same thing back. When it comes to, I think one of the loudest was definitely Mogwai, because I saw them in a small club, like 800, 900 people. And they played a very, very regular post-rock set. Wonderful set. But then you could see that at one point, shortly before the end, Stewart looked at everybody and it was like, okay, all systems go. And they created a wall of very, very ugly noise that made me move back like 2 or 3 rows, which is very unusual for me. But I did that at that moment and it was really hard. I once saw Indian live. That was also pretty loud. LLNN from Copenhagen. Shout out to my friends there. They were incredibly loud. And I think anybody who has ever been to a Sun concert knows what I'm talking about. but that would be that. I haven't been to too many extreme noise electronic sets. I have to admit that. And the ones that I've been to were usually the ones where the PA was not loud enough to do the whole thing justice. Oh yeah, I forgot. A few days ago, I saw Boris live here in our local club, which is possible for 600 people. And I still bet my ass that at one point, not the PA was shaking, but the vents at the top were shaking. So that was incredibly loud.
Sounds right.
And also very, very cool.
Fair enough.
Let's come to our third question. What do you feel about the fact that these days extreme music almost becomes something like a trend?
Sure. I mean, I think it again all boils down to definition of extreme. And I agree. I mean, I think that internet, right? The way the internet is designed, algorithmically to fill a certain sensation itch. It makes sense that extreme sounds or extreme ideas are going to float to the top because they just hit easily. And at the same time, I think it depends on what the definition is. Like I find it hard to believe that the average person is interacting much with genres like harsh noise wall or found sound or extra tone. But I think like brief snippets of extreme sound would make sense as things that people could encounter on the internet and find titillating or kind of immediately emotionally satisfying. So yeah, but I wonder what they mean by a trend. Like what types of extreme music would be considered trendy.
I still remember like 10 years or when did Sunbather come out from Deaf Heaven? I remember that was a trend over here in Europe because a lot of normal newspapers were even talking about the record. And a lot of newspapers, like even the Times and also some German newspapers, spoke about it in their culture pages. There was a moment when all of this black gaze, or let's call it post-black metal, or however we want to call it, when that was popular in a way. I still remember people walking around in Sunbather shirts, and I was like, did you really understand the message of it all?
And I guess, I mean, that's nothing new, right? Like the death metal boom in the early 90s or the black metal scene in Scandinavia was like, big in the news because it's so scintillating. So it makes sense. I guess there's always going to be kind of a public fascination with extreme forms of sound.
Definitely. In your book, you're covering not all of the extreme artists. But when it comes to research, what qualities of the music did you take into account for specifying what is extreme and what is not? Where did you draw the line?
Yeah, so, again, in some ways, my book was not looking for music that sounds like, specifically good or something that I want to listen to on repeat, but rather the concept, the idea behind the release. And so really I was somewhat agnostic about how something sounds. The book doesn't emphasize descriptions of how music sounds that much, except in the service of describing the idea and what it means, which I think makes it a little bit different from some other books, which tend to invest a lot of time and energy in describing things. So in my book, what I wanted to do was understand what are the motivations behind the people who are creating this unusual music. Why does it appeal to them? And trying to tell the stories behind them, the stories behind the people and the stories behind this unusual music. So really, I was guided by the ideas and the stories behind them, as opposed to looking for music that sounds a certain way.
Another very easy question, I guess, but also very interesting for everybody who sees the sheer volume of the stuff that you put into Extreme Music, the book. How long did it take you to complete it?
It took forever. Took a very long time. And so, before this, I'd been listening to experimental music and writing about it in a less organized fashion for many years, like since I was in high school. But I started this book. I think the first interviews were conducted in 2015 or 2016, but the book was sort of polished off in 2020.
Mm.
So unlike, a lot of writers, they'll come up with a book proposal, they'll submit it to publishers or through an agent, and then a publisher will say, that's good, I'll give you an advance. This is the deadline, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't the approach I took. I just started writing this book for my own pleasure, in bits and pieces of free time with some ideas of who I would want to approach to publish it, but
Mm-hmm.
without having any idea if anyone would be interested. And if it didn't get published, I didn't know what I was going to do. But for me, I was inherently interested in the topic enough that it didn't matter that much. So to answer the question, somewhere in the vicinity of 5 to 6 years, in spare scraps of weekends and evenings, whatever time I wasn't working or doing other things. So a long time. Felt like a long time.
How important was it for you to get the perspective of some of the people that you're talking about? Because you use a lot of interviews and quotes. How important was their point of view?
Yeah, I mean, that was the most important thing to me, right? Because the big, like, in a large way, I was approaching this book as an opportunity to solve mysteries, right? There's this whole world of unusual and esoteric music out there, what I sometimes call, unusual musical objects. And they exist, and often there's not a lot of information publicly available about what the story is behind them. So wherever possible, my goal was to say, okay, these things exist. Why? Why did someone create them? Right? Like what motivated them? What was the story behind them? So the book really is trying to uncover the stories and motivations behind all of this unusual music. I find that that's the most interesting form of music journalism, personally. Yeah.
Did you also have to use translators or translations at some point?
Did I? I mean,
Let's
you're
ask
right.
otherwise. Let's ask otherwise. I guess that a lot of the interviews you did were written interviews, right?
Some were written, some were phone or video. So yeah, sometimes I mean we would try to find ways. Sometimes I would translate interviews that were published in other languages. But I don't have access to translation services, so I didn't conduct any interviews fully with a translator.
Starting with starting with the 80s, that's the way the question starts. Starting with the 80s, a large number of artists started incorporating elements characteristic for Japanese artists that have been known for their extreme version of music for a long, long time. And in this way, those artists created cross-cultural connections like Zorn or Discordance Axis. What, according to your opinion, attracted those people who come from a Western cultural background to incorporate elements from the East?
Good question. It's hard to say. I mean, I think there's always been a bit of a mutual fascination between, like, particularly Japanese music and American / European music, right?
Yeah. As a European, I have to say that I find those cross-cultural references more between American and Japanese cultures than between European and Japanese cultures.
You're right. I mean, there's also, like, in Germany, you would know best. There's there's a deep fascination with, like, rockabilly and country music amongst a certain subculture, right? So it's not exclusive to Japan. But I mean, in Japan, there's a lot of people who collect, you're right, primarily American forms of music, things like rockabilly, country, um, very, very American facing or American forward music. And in the 80s, I think maybe this started with the tape trading scene, right? Like
Probably right.
the noise artists coming out of Japan,
Mhm.
trading with artists in the States and Europe. But I think there's just maybe it's just because the two cultures are so like seem so different, at least in superficial ways,
Mhm.
that there's a mutual fascination about kind of very different cultures and how what their art looks like.
Yeah.
In the same way that people are interested in the extreme ideas that are explored in my book. It's a great question and not one that I'm an expert on. I imagine there are like actual, ethnomusicologists and academic people who could answer this question in a lot more sophisticated terms.
When I saw that question, I was hoping that you would answer it the way that I would. Being a history teacher, I have another explanation for that. So for the person who sent in that question, thanks for doing so. My explanation is very simple. Um, American Army. The American
Right.
Army, who of course had a huge connection to the um, Asian side of the Pacific. So there have surely been encounters and exchanges between American GIs and people from Japan, from the Philippines, Guam, from all of those parts of from America's point of view, Western Pacific Rim. So I'm very sure that there has been a lot of interaction there because, and now I take up something that Michael has said, I see the same thing happening here in Germany or in Europe. In Germany, especially, you can see that very, very well in those parts where, for example, I live here in Bavaria. You see a stronger connection to American music, rockabilly, country, and all of that than, for
Mhm.
example, in the northwest of Germany, where America has not been the Allied occupational force after World War II. In the northeast of Germany, you see the British influence. So you have a huge Northern Soul community in Hamburg,
Mhm.
Bremen, and all of those cities. So I think World War II and its aftermath has some kind of historical connection to it. So yeah, just like Michael said, great question. Thanks for that one. We have two more. These days, the music industry got changed significantly over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. We can see some independent labels selling nearly as many records as major labels, Sub Pop, Matador, Epitaph, uh, just to name a few. Back in the days, those labels were making underground rock music. How did these changes affect the landscape of independent music, according to your opinion? So, how did independent labels selling a lot of records, how did that change the scene?
Mm. Right. I mean, that's a incredibly broad question, and can go back to, I mean, historically, independent labels, like in the 50s and 60s, a lot of music was released by independent labels and locals, and then things have shifted over time. I guess the major label, the greatest period of major label dominance was probably from like the 70s through to the 2000s. I mean, I think that
Yeah,
um,
the early
again, ups
2000s.
and
Yeah.
downs.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think the internet changed a lot in terms of how people consume music,
Yeah.
and like I guess a lot of people wonder like what is the role of record labels in this day and age, and yet despite that, there's an explosion of tons of small labels.
Yeah.
Um, I think I don't know. I feel I've always sort of taken I've thought of labels as being kind of like curators, especially in today's day and age, right? You
Yeah.
expect a specific type of sound from Sub Pop or
Mm.
Sacred Bones, or you name
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
label. And I think because of the internet, there's a larger number of people consuming a larger quantity of different types of music. And so inherently, like people may be more broadly consuming from different labels as opposed to sticking what's marketed to them in major labels.
Yeah.
I wish I had something smarter to say about this. Again, this might be the providence of someone academic who could put things into a lot more historical context.
No, I think there's a lot to that, and I think that the internet has a huge part to do with that. I totally
Mm-hmm.
agree with that. And something that we also should bear in mind is what is an independent label? We have to remember that, for example, Motown started out as completely independent.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a connection to a big label, and still Motown produced some of the most incredible stuff of the 60s and early 70s, being an independent label. And for
Mm-hmm.
example, for Motown, that only worked because they basically had a band ready 24/7. So who would even come at 3 o'clock in the morning and, if necessary, record a song? I
And the
think
songwriters on contract.
exactly. And I think
Yeah.
that is something that is also not to be overlooked. But again, a huge question that we could probably talk about for hours, especially about the notion of what is a label in the 2000s. For example, if we look at Sub Pop, what they are releasing nowadays is sometimes far away with what they released
Mm-hmm.
nearly 40 years ago.
Sub Pop is maybe not an example of a label with a specific sound because they've become so broad after starting off as the early
Exactly.
grunge label, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also shown that like Sub Pop is still an independent label, and I think that is a very cool idea and a very cool thing. But it also shows that if you want to remain in a kind of independent label, that you also have to, I don't want to say go with the flow, but you have to at least a little bit adhere to popular taste.
Mm-hmm.
Last one. While you are using the general term extreme music, do you see a difference in the use of this term in different cultures?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's hard. I don't know about different cultures, like geographically, because that would be hard for me to say. But certainly, like I think extreme music to a lot of people means extreme forms of metal, or other extreme forms of rock music, um, like grindcore,
Yeah.
death metal. These genres that are very extreme, often in technical ways.
Yeah.
Whereas um, my approach to this was different, right? It's more about conceptual extremeness. So part of me wonders if extreme music was the right title for the book, because it does, like, I worry that some people are misled and they think, oh, this is going to be one thing, and they're like, why isn't power electronics figuring strongly into your book? A lot of these genres do figure into the book, like grindcore, like death metal, like power violence and
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
But really not, it's not like a historical description of those scenes. It's more describing how they fit into the paradigm of extreme musical concepts. So I think it's used in different ways, and I use one definition of it that might be different from someone else's.
And something that I would also add to that, I think it is nearly impossible to write a chronology of extreme music because
Mhm.
where do you draw the lines of what is extreme? Where do you start? Where do you end? How deep do you go into that? Because I guess that for every decade you could write 1,000-page book on that.
Yes. Yeah. And there are books about death metal. There are
Of
great
course.
books about grindcore. So part of me didn't want to just replicate
Yeah.
things that already exist.
Mm.
So I mean, I think there's a lot of great books there about extreme music scenes that exist. And my book, I try to cover things that really aren't written about anywhere else.
or at least where I would say as a reader that have not been covered in the way that you did it. So again, something that makes it very interesting. Michael, first of all, thanks for all those details, but everybody who is on Veil of Sound doesn't get around the infamous quickfire round. And I've already spoken to you, you know the concept. Everybody who's listening to it, you know the concept. I don't repeat it. So let's just hit it. I will give you 6 questions where you have to decide. Let's start off with something easy. You have to choose between 2 Nirvana songs, Rape Me or Territorial Pissings.
Territorial Pissing.
Why?
More abrasive.
Okay. Unsane. Which record would you rather put on right now? The self-titled record or This Queen?
This Queen. I find it more heavier and louder.
Ah, here we come to the loudness war. Noise. What is it to you? Is it more tribal and primitive or more electric and constructed? First idea that comes
both. Both. Yeah, it really is both.
Which side appeals more?
Which side appeals more? Probably I forgot the word to use, electric and constructed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. 2 masters in their respective genres. My Bloody Valentine versus Sun.
My Bloody Valentine. Yeah, okay. I mean, you know, even though I just earlier used more abrasive as a as a reason to like something over another, I think at heart, you know, the interplay between noise and melody to me, I think that's something that I've historically been very drawn to. So I've invested a lot more time in my life listening to shoegaze and noise rock as opposed to drone metal, post metal, etc. And so it's just I think it's just an aesthetic preference.
But one should probably not think that you don't listen to the second part, right?
No, yeah, it's not that. It's just that I've listened to My Bloody Valentine a lot more than I've listened to some.
I can see the melody thing, yes. Although we also should agree that whenever people who are not familiar with the music, they always say that Sun sounds like very, very unconstructed, and it's just the total opposite, right? So I think both, in a way, are constructed musical references.
Neither. I don't consider either band, like either genre of music, better than one another. But I think when I reflect on my personal, like the music that I've listened to historically, definitely I've invested more of my time listening to shoegaze, post-hardcore, like things along that axis than extreme or abstract forms of metal, which I enjoy, but it's a historical aesthetic preference for me.
Yeah. That's not what I meant. I meant like both bands, Sun and My Bloody Valentine, are not making pure unconstructed and unsequenced noise. Both are very, very constructed in a way, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
You have been talking about post-hardcore a lot. And I know that is one of those terms that could be overanalyzed to the extreme. 2 post-hardcore bands that have been shaping my personal preferences forever and ever. Glassjaw versus Boys That's Fire.
Neither are bands that I've spent a lot of time listening to, and so I can't even answer that question. When I think of but I mean, this is the problem with post-hardcore, right?
Yeah.
It is one of these nebulous terms that like means something and nothing. And so I think like, you know, sometimes this type of music could be called noise rock or alternative metal in the case of Helmet, one of my faves. you know, even just indie rock, right? Like the
Hmm.
original expression for this.
Okay.
So yeah, but like Thorsten, there's so much music in the world.
It
Like
is.
there's just so much. I
Yes.
don't know how people manage to listen to it and have common frames of reference, right?
It only works if you listen to one new record every day, which I
If
have
I
been
had
trying for
time
the
to do
last.
that.
I have been trying to do that for the last 3 years, and I would say, let's say 3 years is like 1,000 days roughly, right? So I would
Mhm.
say out of 1,000 days, I was able to do that 700, 750.
That's amazing.
But
I
it
did
it very often becomes a blur.
right. I mean, that's the problem, right? Like how like it's hard to just keep track of that in your mind.
It only works.
But
It
I'm
only
very
works with
impressed.
spreadsheets.
Right.
I I
Spreadsheets.
I listen to stuff and I have to put it in like categories for myself, like ratings.
Yeah,
Also for our year event stuff that we always do.
that makes sense.
Microtonal music. Yes or no? Is that something that can
So
attract your ear?
did you say microtonal music?
Yes.
Yes. Um, I mean, anything can attract my ear, so
Hmm.
I'll say yes.
Hmm.
Do I listen to microtonal music a lot of the time? Um, Not music that identifies as being microtonal specifically, but yeah, I mean, I think any any sound concept is inherently interesting, and so I'm never going to say no to that
Hmm.
unless
Last
it's
one.
like
Yeah, you go.
racist music or something.
Yeah. But that's
Like
not.
unless it's something that's inherently offensive. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's also always a question, right? Like, how. That is a good question for you. Can you separate the art from the artist?
Um, I, you know, case by case. It's a
Hmm. Yeah,
hard
yeah,
question to answer.
that's true.
I talked about this before in previous interviews, but in the book, I made a point of like there are bands that are, are racist or otherwise offensive that share commonalities with. For example, there's a chapter on unusual packaging, and there's some releases that have been put out by acts that I would consider offensive who have used unusual packaging concepts. So I made the decision I wasn't going to include that stuff because I didn't want it in my book. Um, so yeah. Um, but your question about whether about like separating the artist from the art is a really big question,
It
and
is.
I mean, like it could be as simple as like um, I disagree with this person politically because they're a capitalist and I'm a communist. Like I don't know if that is something
Yeah, I
that
know, I
is a
know.
reason to versus someone who's like highly offensive or saying something that is just beyond the pale. Um, anyway, I'm getting us off topic. I'm sorry to derail
No. That
your
is a
rapid
very
fire round.
no. That is a very good question, and it's also very difficult. I still remember a few weeks ago, my little 10-year-old daughter came in, and I was just listening to um, to Kendrick Lamar, and she said, "Daddy, he's using a lot of F words and a lot of curses and swears a lot." And I was like, "Yeah, but he's for great." Oh, yeah, you're right. And it's like, on the one hand, the guy is amazing, and on the other, like, he's sometimes using offensive language. But I know what you mean. It's difficult, right? We Shortly, I still have one, but I want to know your opinion on that one. Favorite label? Do you have something like a favorite label at the moment?
Hmm. Um, that's a wonderful question.
I know.
I can't. I mean, it's almost as hard as saying a favorite band.
Hmm.
I've had when I was young, when I was in high school, my favorite label was Matador Records, but that's
Okay.
because I got a Matador Records compilation from a used
Hmm.
CD store, and then I got a Ninja Tune compilation, and that was my favorite label for a while.
Hmm.
But I think for me, um, I just love the how many labels there have been, how many of them have developed a prominent aesthetic,
Hmm.
and how they figure into the history of music. So I feel like it's just impossible to pick one that um, but I do like labels that establish a defined aesthetic and that, labels like 4AD or warp or mute, right? These seminal labels that have designed a specific aesthetic and built themselves around that. So yeah, I'm sorry. Once again, I can't answer your question.
Oh,
What's
you
your favorite
did.
label,
You
Thorsten?
did. That is totally fine. Mine.
Uh-huh.
It definitely used to be Sub Pop in the early 90s. Um, then at some point, I still remember I had a huge Discord phase. Um,
Mm,
then, there was this Equal Vision early
hmm
2000s period where we basically everybody I knew was collecting Equal Vision.
hmm
Um, for a few years, it has been Pelagic Records out of Berlin. A friend of mine loves Dunk Records from Belgium, who do perfect post rock.
hmm
The Flenser and Sacred Bones have had phenomenal years. Have to
hmm
say that. And of course, I have to give a shout out to my friend Philip from Switzerland. His unfortunately soon to be defunct label, Elusive Sound, was an eye opener when it came to packaging and when it came to the ability of delivering records without a scratch or a crooked edge. So I've never had
hmm
any Elusive Sound record coming here with any flaw. That was amazing. Last question. We both listen to a lot of music. How do you listen to music? Vinyl or streaming?
Um, variable. Actually, I have quite a CD collection, so
Mhm.
I actually happen to listen to CDs more than I listen to my vinyl collection.
Mhm.
Um, the and part of that is because I reviewed music for so long in the 2000s that you just accumulate, and plus a lot of tapes. But actually, my tape deck recently busted. I have to get it fixed. I do listen to a lot of streaming, and lately I think this is because work is very busy and I have a young child. I listen a lot to WFMU, the New Jersey radio station,
Mhm.
um, which they just have. It's a freeform radio station with a lot of really interesting and esoteric programming. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's easier to just put that on and
Mhm.
play it and have it playing during the day than to select out things. Um, but the internet obviously is both terrible in some ways and
Yeah,
wonderful in others.
that's
So
true.
the ability to just pull things up at I want to listen to this and to pull it up is a very hard to beat convenience.
Yeah, availability, right? So, Michael, thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. And for everybody out there, if you want to do some digging and if you want to know a little bit more about concepts of extreme music, go uh, go and get yourself a copy of Michael's book. It's out in a few weeks on Feral House. So do that. Michael, your chance for any last words.
Nothing exciting. Just thank you so much, Thorsten. It was a real pleasure chatting today. The questions that everyone submitted and that you had were just so wonderful, and I'm so glad I had the opportunity to do this.
Thank you very much, my friend. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye bye.
You too. Bye now.